Okay, so we're with Alden Meyer of Union of Concerned Scientists. Where do we stand this afternoon?
Well, we're at the very end game here, and it's either time for them to reach a deal and resolve the crunch issues that they've been negotiating for 2 weeks, or realize they're not going to come to a package, and if they do that, then they're talking about scenarios of what happens next.
We were close to a deal. It felt like we were close to a deal over the past 12 hours or so. What happened?
Well, there was a lot of momentum last night coming out of the Indaba with the ministers around a stronger package of decisions on the Kyoto Protocol and on launching a new negotiation under the convention. And some text was put on the table last night that ministers took home. They had some initial discussions, took it home. There was support building for that. This morning, the text under the LCA track, the Long-Term Cooperative Action Track, came out. It had been cut in length more than half from what the last version people saw. More importantly, many important pieces to individual countries and group of countries had been dropped from that text. And so all of a sudden you had everyone scrambling saying, wait a minute, this isn't where I thought my issue was in the text, whether it's mitigation, adaptation, technology, reducing emissions from deforestation. And so people started focusing, how am I going to get my stuff back in that text? But the problem is we're running out of time. And there's not time to use the usual negotiation process, bring it to the plenary floor, go through amendments, all that stuff. And it's a critical part of the package. So you can't adopt the Kyoto Protocol amendments and launch the long-term negotiation without the near-term bits that are in that LCA text that various countries want. So without that text being perceived to be viable to get decisions out of this COP, people started to realize all that stuff was going to be postponed down the road until COP18 in Qatar, and therefore the sort of momentum and the will to adopt the other pieces on the Kyoto Protocol and the long-term mandate started to weaken because it's all part of a package.
A couple specific examples of key things that were dropped from that text?
The European Union, for example, is very concerned. A lot of language they wanted in there, and the small island states wanted in there on a mitigation work plan for next year to really get countries to step up the plate and think what more they can do to close the gap between the 2-degree target and the pledges and actions that are now on the table. A lot of that language was out. There were some very detailed items on reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation that had been agreed and sent in to be put in the text. They weren't there. There was concerns about on the developing countryside that some of the language that the Europeans and U.S. needed on monitoring and reporting and review of country actions had been taken out, and so a feeling that the text was now imbalanced. So there are just bits that dropped out here and there that looked, like it was going to provoke countries to not want to move forward with that text unless they could have another go-round at fixing it. And as I said, this is the negotiating text they've been working on for 2 weeks. It's very late in the game to say put it on the table, take it or leave it. Clearly there wouldn't be support for just taking it with the things that have been taken out, and yet it's very hard to see a process and the time to negotiate putting those things back in. So it left delegates with a bit of a dilemma, and ministers, do you do the package anyway and try to go forward with a slimmed down LCA text that doesn't have everything they want to get the deal that they were close to getting last night on the new mandate and the KP, or do you recognize that we don't have a consensus package here and admit that we're going to need to postpone and maybe consider resuming a little bit down the road? That's the choice they're now faced with because of this procedural hurdle.
So what happened? How did all this stuff just disappear overnight?
Well, that's the question, and no one really knows. People are trying to figure out, obviously it was in the hands of the chair of the LCA, Dan Reef-Snyder, who's from the State Department of the U.S., working with the Secretariat, working with the chairs of the facilitation groups, but I think that's a question that people are asking. How did many of these delicate compromises suddenly disappear from the text? Obviously people wanted the text streamlined from the 138 pages it was on Wednesday, but as I said, they cut it more than in half and down to 56 pages, and more than half of those 56 pages are actually technical annexes that sort of give the details on some of the decisions. They're not really political text, so it was cut down too much, and pieces were dropped from it that are very important to key countries, and that's created a little bit of a backlash today.
So we're in mid-afternoon of the first extra day. What do we expect in the next few hours?
Well, right now the presidency is having consultations with the core group of ministers, the representative group of 26 ministers that represent all regions and all major blocks of countries, trying to see what are the essential pieces that would need to be changed in those three texts, the Kyoto Protocol text, the new negotiating mandate text, and the LCA text. What are the key pieces that would have to be put back in to have a good political coalition around that that package being brought to the plenary. She was originally, I think, thinking maybe taking it into the plenary and trying to move it through there, but she was warned by ministers from almost all the countries that that was a procedural nightmare, that if you took this text and tried to amend it on the floor with 190 countries, you'd never get out of there alive. So it was best to keep working while you can with the ministers who are here before they start leaving later this evening to try to reach a political consensus. Then you can work with your negotiators and bring it to the plenary and take the time to go through and pass it once you've made the political deal. So we should know in the next few hours if they've been able to reach a political agreement about how to fix those underlying texts, or if they've just run out of time and ministers are leaving and they're going to have to suspend the meeting.
You've been at these meetings for years, almost since they started. Is this typical?
No, most of the COPs, you know, they often go into the night on Friday and sometimes early Saturday morning. But most of them, you know, they're not as dramatic as this. You get the issues resolved. The one other COP in history where they didn't reach agreement as ministers were starting to leave was The Hague in 2000. It was right after the U.S. election, so other countries didn't know if they were going to be negotiating with a Bush administration or a Gore administration. There was a big fight between the European Union and the U.S. over land use change and forestry in the context of the Kyoto Protocol, and it broke down in bickering and finger pointing as ministers were leaving, so they had to suspend the meeting, resume it 5 months later in Bonn in May. By that time, President Bush had unilaterally declared the Kyoto Protocol dead, and that was provocative enough for the rest of the world to rally and save the Kyoto Protocol, adopt the Marrakesh Accords the following fall, and rally up against the United States. So basically George Bush saved the process at that point. The problem is here that some of the U.S. behavior starting at the beginning of last week has added to this process being polarized and constrained. Coming in here and saying that we don't expect countries are going to do anything about the level of emissions ambition until the year 2020, and that's okay, as Jonathan Pershing from the U.S. said at the beginning of last week, just set the whole thing off on a wrong turn, that there's no sense of urgency, that the U.S. isn't going to support action, and it really got us off on the wrong foot here. And that's, you know, a lot of the conversation has been what will it take to get the U.S. to accept a mandate for new negotiations, and what does it expect from China and some of the others to be able to do that. And that's been a lot of the haggling over the last couple days on that text. Obviously the Kyoto Protocol, that's almost entirely a European issue right now because the U.S. isn't in it. Japan and Russia and Canada have said they're not going to be part of it. So the EU is still saying they're willing to make a deal and adopt amendments here on Kyoto, but only if the other parts of the package move forward, both the mandate for new negotiations and the fixes they need, particularly on mitigation ambition in the LCA text.
Okay, final question. What is your sense of the chances of a progressive outcome still coming out of here, a regressive outcome coming out of here, or no outcome?
Well, I think it's really between a progressive outcome or no outcome, you know, unfortunately, the chances of the progressive outcome are dwindling by the minute. I mean, as I said, ministers have plane flights. A number of them are leaving 6, 7, 8 p.m.
They can't change those?
Well, some of them are trying to change them. Some of them don't want to change them, I think, and are sort of giving up on this process. So we'll see. I mean, I'm hoping that there's going to be a fix, but I know there's sort of a sense of fatigue and sort of frustration setting in among some circles. I think the EU, the small island states, the least developed countries are hanging in there. We understand that they're working together on a joint text on raising ambition on mitigation. Once we get that, we will be fanning out and lobbying delegates from other countries and ministers and trying to get them to support that, because that might be the spark that might be needed to revive the last-minute chances for these talks. But you know, to be realistic, I can't rule out the scenario where at the end of the day the presidency says we came close, but we didn't quite get there. I've got to suspend the conference of the parties, and we will resume in 2012 under my presidency.
Would that be a disaster?
It would not be as bad a disaster as having the whole thing collapse in crisis or postponing everything a full year to COP18 in Qatar. It's clearly not what we want, but it would be the preferable of those three options if we can't get a progressive outcome here.
Thank you, Alden.
Sure.